that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come before the Senate this afternoon to address the disturbing matter of Vladimir Kara-Murza and to call on the State Department to act and act decisively now on behalf of Mr. Kara-Murza. Vladimir Kara-Murza is a courageous Russian leader, an outspoken opponent of the dictatorship of President Putin there in Russia, and a leader in the democracy effort in his home country of Russia. Many colleagues, myself included, know Vladimir Kara-Murza personally. I admire him. I consider him a friend. Other senators will remember who Mr. Kara-Murza is after I remind the Senate of his history. Mr. Kara-Murza was the right-hand man of the late Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov. I say the late Russian leader because he was assassinated within the shadows of the Kremlin in 2015 after a career of courageous, outspoken opposition to the dictatorship in Russia. That was Boris Nemtsov. His assistant and right-hand man, Kara-Murza, was just this week sentenced to a 25-year prison term in Russia, having already served 1 year in prison for the simple offense of speaking out on behalf of freedom and democracy in Russia. Over the years, Vladimir Kara-Murza has spoken up against President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. He's spoken out against the suppression of human rights in Russia. He's worked with members of Congress. He's worked with Senator Cardin. He's worked with senators like me, with former Senator John McCain, and he's been instrumental in getting us to pass and getting the administrations to sign important human rights legislation, like the Magnitsky Act, which has now been adopted by some 35 or more countries internationally to crack down on those individuals within a dictatorship regime who have benefited from the violations of human rights. How has Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza paid for this offense of speaking out on behalf of democracy and freedom? He's the one who's twice been poisoned by the Putin regime on 2 occasions, and they fumbled it twice. Now they've got a third chance to kill him. And it may be that unless the State Department acts quickly, Mr. President, the Putin regime may finally get their wish and see the obituary of Vladimir Kara-Murza. His life is in danger now because of his previous poisonings, both of which he recovered from. He has suffered already from polyneuropathy. He now, after a year imprisonment, has lost 40 pounds. He's lost feeling in both of his feet now and is losing the feeling in one of his arms. That's the situation he finds himself in the week, where he was sentenced to a 25-year prison term simply for speaking out on behalf of freedom. Even under Russian law, a statutory scheme that none of us would approve of, even under Russian law, a diagnosis such as this would lead to the release of any prisoner, but not apparently for Vladimir Kara-Murza. Predictably, the Russian courts have violated their own law to keep him detained. Today, we read about many victims of Russia's despotism. We have been talking this week about former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, who's been sitting in a Russian prison since 2018 under fabricated charges, and then the recently detained Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. Those two individuals need our support and are getting the support of the State Department, the same support that Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza needs now and that the Senate should demand of the State Department. The State Department has the capability, as they've done for these two other prisoners, Gershkovich and Whelan. They have the ability to designate Mr. Kara-Murza as, quote, wrongfully detained, unquote, under the Levinson Act. This classification would make the release of Vladimir Kara-Murza a top U.S. government priority. Granting this designation would be a major step forward and would raise this case to the highest level of attention within the State Department and with regard to their negotiations with the Kremlin. It would give negotiators new tools to act strongly and quickly. And strong action and quick action is needed now to save the very life of Vladimir Kara-Murza. Efforts on his behalf could be conducted alongside the efforts that are being initiated for Mr. Whelan and Mr. Gershkovich, which I very much support. I implore the State Department, Mr. President, to elevate this case also and save the life of Vladimir Kara-Murza. And I implore all members of Congress to join me in urging our government to take immediate action to support all three of these gentlemen. Let's resolve that our government and our State Department act in every way possible to gain the release of these prisoners, and in particular, this prisoner whose life is hanging at the very moment by a thread. I met with Vladimir Kara-Murza's wife only yesterday. She had met with the State Department, along with her attorneys, along with some advocates. Clearly, she fears for the life of her husband. She's a resident of Northern Virginia, by the way, with two small children. She fears for the life of her husband, and she worries about the future of herself and her children, but also she wonders why the State Department would not act in the most forceful way possible, and that is with this designation of wrongfully detained. Senator Cardin and I will be speaking to members of the Senate and the House about this. We'll be passing around a letter to sign to the Secretary of State urging that this matter be given the highest consideration, and perhaps we can diplomatically obtain the release of this courageous person who's committed no crime and save the life of Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thank you, Mr. President, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call a roll.